At 9:47 in the morning, on September 20th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders sat in the cockpit of a Japanese fighter at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California. He was getting ready to fly a plane that had killed hundreds of American pilots. The plane was a Mitsubishi A6M2, Model 2110, serial number 4593. It had belonged to Flight Petty Officer First Class Tateyoshi Koga. Koga was dead. His neck had broken when this Zero flipped upside down in an Aleutian marsh 2.5 months earlier. But the plane had survived almost completely. Now Sanders was about to discover something that would change the way every American pilot in the Pacific Fort Sanders was a career naval aviator. He had been flying military planes for 9 years and had more flight test hours than almost any pilot in the Navy. He knew planes. He understood how they moved, how they reacted, and how they could kill you if you made a mistake. The Zero in front of him was painted in United States Navy colors, blue-gray over light gold-gray, with American signs on the wings and body. But it was still a Zero. It was still the plane that had ruled the Pacific skies since December 7th, 1941. It was still the fighter that American pilots feared more than anything in the war. Sanders had studied every intelligence report about the Zero. He had read stories from pilots who survived fights with it. He had looked at spy photos. He knew the numbers, a 12-to-1 kill ratio in China. On Easter Sunday, April 5th, 1942, 36 Zeros faced 60 British planes over Colombo. They shot down 27 British planes, 15 Hurricanes, 8 Swordfish, and 4 Fulmars. For the loss of just 1 Zero, American P-39s were destroyed at high altitude. F-2A Buffaloes were wiped out over the Philippines. F-4. F Wildcats barely survived against an enemy that could turn tighter, climb faster, and outmaneuver anything the United States had. The official American tactic against a Zero was simple. Avoid regular dogfighting. Use dive and zoom tactics. Do not try to turn with it. Do not try to outmaneuver it. You would lose. But avoiding fights meant leaving bomber groups alone. It meant leaving your wingman to die. It meant letting the enemy control the skies, which they used to sink carriers, attack airfields, and destroy whole squadrons on the ground. American pilots were dying because nobody knew how to beat the Zero. Nobody knew its weaknesses. Nobody had flown one until now. The Zero Sanders was about to fly had been captured on Akutan Island in the Aleutians after Koga died on June 4th, 1942. It had taken 3 tries to get it out of the marsh. The first team on July 11th had checked the site and recovered Koga's body. The second team on July 12th failed when their ship lost 2 anchors. The third team on July 15th finally succeeded with heavy equipment. The plane was shipped to Seattle on USS St. Miguel, arriving August 1st, then sent by barge to San Diego. Arriving August 12th, Navy mechanics spent weeks fixing the damaged parts: vertical stabilizer, rudder, wingtips, flaps, canopy, landing gear, and propeller. They straightened bent metal, replaced broken parts, and made parts that could not be found. The plane was now 98% original, with only 2% made up by the mechanics, as Sanders later said. Sanders started the engine. The 14-cylinder Nakajima Sakai 12 radial came to life with a sound that was both familiar and strange, similar to American radial engines, but with a different pitch and a different rhythm. The propeller spun up. Sanders checked the instruments. Oil pressure normal, temperature rising steadily. Everything looked correct. He taxied to the runway. The Zero felt light on the ground and very responsive. The controls moved easily under his hands. He had been told the aircraft weighed about 5,555 pounds fully loaded, according to museum specifications. That was 1,871 pounds lighter than an F-4F Wildcat at 7,426 pounds. The weight difference was important. Sanders pushed the throttle forward and began his takeoff roll. The Zero accelerated quickly. The tail lifted. The aircraft took off after a very short ground run. Sanders pulled the gear up and started to climb. The first thing he noticed was how light the controls felt, almost delicate. The stick moved with almost no force. The aircraft responded immediately to every movement. At low speed, the Zero flew beautifully. It was stable, easy to handle, and very agile. Sanders made a few gentle turns. The aircraft rolled smoothly. He tried a steeper bank. The Zero turned easily and quickly. He immediately understood why Japanese pilots loved this plane. At low speed, nothing in the American inventory could match it. Sanders climbed to 5,000 feet and began to test the aircraft's handling. He tried stalls. The Zero warned him. Before it broke, then recovered gently. He tried spins. The aircraft spun cleanly and recovered quickly. Everything about the Zero at low speed was forgiving, responsive, and well-balanced. It was the kind of plane that made average pilots feel skilled and skilled pilots feel unbeatable. Then Sanders pushed the throttle forward and sped up. At 190 knots, the Zero still felt good. The controls were light, and the aircraft was responsive. Sanders almost began to believe the reports from pilots who said the Zero could do anything. Then he crossed 200 knots, indicated airspeed, and everything changed. Sanders tried to roll the aircraft to the right. The stick moved. The ailerons moved, but the aircraft was slow and sluggish. It felt like the air had become thick like molasses. Sanders had to use both hands on the stick to force the roll. The Zero responded, but not quickly or immediately. There was a delay between input and action that did not exist at lower speeds. Sanders tried rolling to the left. The aircraft rolled more easily, still not as sharp as at low speed, but better than rolling right. The controls were uneven. The Zero preferred rolling left. Rolling right needed much more force and gave much less response. Sanders increased the speed to 220 knots, then 240 knots. The problem got worse. At 250 knots, rolling the Zero to the right was impossible. According to his later reports, the ailerons froze. The control stick needed huge force to move, and the aircraft barely responded. Sanders felt like he was trying to roll a truck instead of a fighter. This was the weakness. This was what American pilots needed to know. The Zero could not roll quickly at high speed, especially to the right. It could not do fast reversals above 200 knots. Any American pilot who knew this could use it. Get the Zero into a high-speed fight, force it above 200 knots, then roll hard right before the Zero pilot could follow. The Zero could not match a fast right roll at high speed. Its controls would lock up. The American pilot could escape or turn for a shot while the Zero struggled to respond. Sanders kept testing the Zero. He tried other moves. He pushed the Zero into a steep dive to test negative acceleration. The engine coughed and stopped. The carburetor was a float-type design that could not handle negative G-forces. Fuel flow was blocked. The engine starved and quit until Sanders pulled positive G-forces again. That was the second weakness. The Zero could not follow an American plane through a pushover dive. Its engine would stop. Any pilot being chased by a Zero could push the nose down, put the Zero under negative acceleration, and watch its engine quit, while the American plane's pressure-fed carburetor kept working normally. Sanders also noticed the Zero's lack of armor. There was no steel plate behind the pilot and no bulletproof glass. The fuel tanks could not seal themselves. A few hits from 50 caliber machine guns would turn the Zero into a fireball. The Japanese had given up protection for performance. The plane was fast and agile because it was light and unarmored. But that also meant Zero pilots died easily when hit. Sanders landed after 25 minutes. He climbed out and immediately wrote his first report. His hands were still shaking from the adrenaline. He had just flown the most dangerous enemy plane in the Pacific and found its deadly flaws. His report clearly said the ailerons froze above 200 knots, so rolling at those speeds was slow and needed a lot of force on the stick. The plane rolled left much easier than right. Also, its engine cut out under negative acceleration because of the float carburetor. Sanders wrote the solution for American pilots who were being outmaneuvered and could not escape a chasing Zero. Go into a vertical power dive using negative acceleration to open distance while the Zero's engine stops. And at about 200 knots, roll hard right before the Zero pilot can aim. Those 3 tips would save hundreds of American lives. Sanders flew 23 more test flights over the next 25 days, from September 20th to October 15th, 1942. Each flight confirmed what he found on the first flight. The Zero was a great low-speed dogfighter, but had serious limits at high speed. American tactics had to change. Stop trying to turn with the Zero. Use speed. Use high-speed moves. Use hard right rolls above 200 knots. Use negative G pushovers to stop the Zero's engine. The tactical advice was radioed to Pacific Fleet units right after Sanders's first flight in late September 1942. Pilots in combat areas got the briefings within days. Some were doubtful. The Zero had dominated for so long that many pilots could not believe it had weaknesses. Others were desperate for an advantage and used the tactics right away. Marine. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh was one of the first pilots to use Sanders' discoveries in combat. Walsh was flying an F-4U Corsair on August 15, 1943, during the Solomon Islands campaign when he fought enemy planes over La Vella. He shot down 2 dive bombers and 1 fighter. Then on August 30th, over Kahili, he met about 50 Zeros. Walsh had been briefed about the captured Zero. He knew what to do. When a Zero got on his tail, Walsh put his Corsair into a split S maneuver, nose down, inverted, pulling through. His Corsair sped up fast in the dive. He needed at least 240 knots, preferably 260 knots. Then, as Sanders' report said, Walsh rolled hard right. As he rolled and kept diving, bullets from the Zero zipped past his belly. The Zero pilot was shooting but missing because his plane could not roll right fast enough to follow Walsh through the move. Walsh knew from the intelligence from the captured Zero that it rolled slower to the right than to the left. If he had not known which way to roll, he probably would have rolled left instinctively. If he had done that, the Zero would have turned with him, aimed, and killed him. Walsh shot down 4 Zeros that day before he had to ditch. He got the Medal of Honor for these actions. He later said that knowing what to do when a Zero was on his tail, information from the captured Zero, saved his life many times. Walsh survived the war with 21 confirmed kills, becoming the 4th-ranking Marine Corps ace. But Sanders was not the only pilot to test the captured Zero. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Trapnell was the chief of the test flight section at Naval Air Station Anacostia in Washington, D.C. Trapnell was considered one of the best and most experienced naval test pilots of his generation. He had tested almost every type of plane in the American inventory. In early 1943, the captured Zero was sent to Anacostia so Trapnell could do comparative testing. Trapnell flew the Zero in performance moves, while other pilots flew American fighters doing the same moves. They pretended to have air battles. They tested how the Zero compared to the F-4F Wildcat, the F-4U Corsair, the P-38 Lightning, and other American planes. The goal was to write down exactly what each American plane could and could not do against a Zero in certain situations. Trapnell confirmed everything Sanders had found. The Zero was faster than the Wildcat at most heights and climbed faster, but it was easier to damage and less maneuverable at high speed. The Zero could climb faster than American planes below 15,000 feet, but American planes with 2-stage superchargers could beat the Zero above 20,000 feet. The Zero had amazing range, but was fragile. American pilots had to avoid slow-turning dogfights and instead use high-speed hit-and-run attacks, diving passes, and energy tactics that used the Zero's control problems at high speed. Trapnell's report gave specific advice for each plane type. F-4F Wildcat pilots should never try to turn with a Zero below 250 knots. Instead, attack from high above, fire quickly, then dive away using the Wildcat's better dive speed. The Zero could not follow a high-speed dive without its controls locking. F-4U Corsair pilots should use their plane's better speed and high-altitude performance. Stay fast, stay high, use boom and zoom attacks. Do not slow down. Do not fight a turning battle. P-38 pilots should do the same. Speed and altitude were their advantages. Use them. Never let a Zero trap you into a slow-turning fight. This tactical intelligence was sent throughout the Pacific Theater by late 1942 and early 1943 fighter squadrons added Sanders' findings into training. New pilots learned the Zero's weaknesses before they ever went into combat. The results were quick and clear. Before the captured Zero was tested, American fighter-to-fighter kill ratios against Zeros were barely better than 1-to-1. F-4F Wildcats were losing pilots almost as fast as they were shooting down Zeros. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February 1943, after Sanders' tactical advice was shared, Wildcat squadrons that used the new tactics saw their kill ratios rise to 5.9-to-1. That meant nearly 6 Zeros destroyed for every Wildcat lost in air-to-air fights. The improvement was not because American planes suddenly got better. The Wildcat in February 1943 was the same plane it had been in June 1942. The improvement was because American pilots knew how to fight the Zero. They understood its weaknesses. They knew to avoid turning dogfights. They knew to use speed and altitude. They knew to roll hard right above 200 knots. They knew to use negative G moves to stop the Zero's engine. Japanese pilots started noticing the change in American tactics in late 1942. Flight reports from Imperial Japanese Navy units said that American fighters were no longer trying to turn with Zeros. American pilots were using hit-and-run tactics, diving attacks, and high-speed passes. Zeros that had previously forced Americans into turning fights could not catch enemy planes that simply dived away at high speed. Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's most experienced pilots. Official Japanese records showed 28 aerial victories for him, though some said more. He had been fighting American pilots since Pearl Harbor. In August 1942, Sakai was badly hurt during the Guadalcanal campaign when he mistook Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers for fighters and was hit by a rear gunner. He spent months recovering from serious head wounds that left him partly blind. When he returned to combat in 1943, he immediately noticed that American tactics had changed. Sakai later wrote that American pilots were no longer making the same mistakes they had in early 1942. They were no longer trying to dogfight with Zeros. They were using their plane's strengths and taking advantage of the Zero's weaknesses. Sakai found it harder to shoot down American fighters using the tactics that had worked so well in the first year of the war. He was later promoted to ensign in August 1944 and sub-lieutenant in 1945. But he never reached the rank of lieutenant commander, as some sources incorrectly say. Other experienced Japanese pilots noticed the same changes. The Americans had learned something. Japanese intelligence tried to figure out what had changed. They examined wrecks of downed American planes but found no big differences. American fighters looked the same as always. The engines were the same. The weapons were the same. Nothing visible had changed. What the Japanese did not know was that the change was not in the planes. The change was in the tactics. The change was knowledge. Knowledge that came from Sanders' tests. The knowledge from Sanders' flights in the captured Zero was impossible for the Japanese to fight against because it was invisible. You cannot make tactics against an enemy who knows your plane better than you do. By early 1943, American test pilots had flown the Zero more than most Japanese pilots ever would. Sanders and Trapnell had recorded every quirk, every limit, every weakness. That information was in the hands of American combat pilots. Japanese pilots were still flying the Zero the same way they always had, but the Americans now knew exactly how to counter every move. The effect on Japanese pilots was big. For the first year of the war, Zero pilots had ruled the Pacific skies. They knew they could outmaneuver any American fighter in a turning dogfight. That confidence was complete. But by mid-1943, that confidence was fading. Zeros were being shot down more often. Experienced pilots were being killed. New replacement pilots were even less ready to face American fighters that now used tactics made to take advantage of the Zero's weaknesses. Commander Masatake Okumiya, an air staff officer on the carrier Ryujo, the same carrier Koga had launched from, knew the Zero's capabilities and the effect of its capture. He later co-wrote a book with Zero designer Jiro Horikoshi in 1956, saying that capturing Koga's Zero was no less serious than the defeat at Midway and helped speed up Japan's final defeat. This came from someone who understood both the tactical and strategic effect of Americans knowing everything about the Zero. The captured Zero stayed in American hands until February 1945. It was used for training, tactical development, and engineering study. Hundreds of American pilots flew mock combat against it. Hundreds more attended briefings where they learned its features. The plane was eventually destroyed in a ground accident when a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver lost control while taxiing and hit the Zero. Commander Richard Cromland was flying the Helldiver when its propeller cut the Zero into pieces. By then, the Zero was no longer the most dangerous plane in the Pacific. American fighters had caught up and passed it. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered service in August 1943. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero, had more guns, was much tougher, and could match the Zero's maneuverability at combat speeds while staying better at high speed. Hellcat pilots used the same tactics Sanders had developed: boom and zoom, high-speed attacks, no turning dogfights. The Hellcat's kill ratio against all Japanese planes was 19-1. The F-4U Corsair also benefited from Sanders' work. Corsair pilots knew from training exactly how the Zero would act at different speeds and heights. They knew when the Zero's controls would stiffen, when to roll right, and when to use -G. The Corsair's kill ratio was 11-1. Even the older F-4F Wildcat kept getting better. By the end of the war, the official Wildcat kill ratio had gone up to 6.9-1, according to Naval History and Heritage Command records. 1,327 enemy planes destroyed versus 178 American planes lost. The improvement was not because the Wildcat became a better plane. It was because Wildcat pilots knew how to fight. The effect of Sanders' test flights went beyond just kill ratios. Military historians say that tactical knowledge from the captured Zero changed the Pacific Air War, though they argue about exactly how many lives were saved. Marine ace William Leonard called the captured Zero a treasure and said no other captured plane had ever revealed so many secrets when the need was so great. Many aces credited the Akutan Zero tactics with saving their lives many times. However, some historians argue that it did not take Koga's Zero to make tactics that could beat the plane. The THAC weave had been developed before Pearl Harbor based on intelligence from China. 9 Zeros were recovered from Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and studied. Trapnell himself said on October 6, 1942, that the general impression of the plane was exactly what intelligence had predicted, including performance, showing that much was already known. Still, the value of having a flyable Zero cannot be overstated. It gave confirmation of intelligence, exact performance numbers, and most importantly, hands-on experience that could be shared with combat pilots. The testing showed exact speeds where control stiffening happened, exact roll rates at different speeds, and specific tactical advice that pilots could use immediately. Sanders never got public recognition for his test flights during the war. His name did not appear in the news. His work was secret. The test reports were classified. The tactical advice was only given to combat units. Sanders continued his career as a Navy pilot. He flew combat missions later in the war. He tested other captured enemy planes. He trained new pilots. He survived the war and eventually became a Rear Admiral before retiring. When asked about the Zero test flights, he said he was just doing his job. Testing planes was what test pilots did. The fact that the plane was an enemy fighter that gave critical tactical knowledge was just circumstance. Trapnell also never got public recognition for testing the Zero during the war. He went on to become one of the most important figures in naval aviation history. He co-founded the United States Naval Test Pilot School with Commander Sidney Sherby and with support from Rear Admiral Apollo S. Runn. The official school started January 22, 1948, with the first class on July 6, 1948. Trapnell was promoted to commander, then captain by May 1943. He was the first Navy pilot to fly a jet. He influenced carrier aviation for decades, but his work with the captured Zero was only one of hundreds of test programs he did in his career. Tadayoshi Koga, the Japanese pilot whose Zero was captured, died instantly when his plane flipped in the Aleutian Marsh. He was 19 years old, born September 10, 1922. His wingmen had circled above, unsure if he was alive or dead. They had orders to destroy any Zero that crashed in enemy territory, but they could not attack the plane while Koga might still be alive inside. They left. They reported the crash. They did not know that decision would give Americans the intelligence advantage that helped turn the Pacific Air War. Koga was first buried in a shallow grave on July 11, 1942, then reburied in a Christian ceremony on July 12th. He was exhumed in 1947 by the American Graves Registration Service and reburied on Adak Island with a marker reading Unknown Japanese Flyer. His remains were probably among 223 unidentified Japanese remains cremated in 1953 and buried at Chidori-Gafuchi National Cemetery in Tokyo. His family never knew during the war that his plane had been captured and flown by American pilots. The Japanese military never officially admitted losing the Zero until after the war. The Akutan Zero, as it came to be called, was one of the most important intelligence wins of World War II. It was not a secret weapon. It was not a code machine. It was not a strategic plan. It was a plane. But by flying that plane and recording its weaknesses, Sanders gave American pilots the knowledge they needed to survive and win. That knowledge spread from pilot to pilot, squadron to squadron across the Pacific. It changed tactics. It changed training. It changed outcomes. The story shows that knowledge is just as important as technology in war. The Zero did not change between June 1942 and February 1943. It was the same plane with the same abilities and the same limits. But American pilots' understanding of how to fight it changed completely. And that change in understanding caused a measurable improvement in combat performance. In any fight, knowing your opponent's abilities and limits is as valuable as having better technology. You can have the best plane in the world, but if you use it wrong against an enemy who knows its weaknesses, you will lose. On the other hand, you can have a weaker plane but still win if you know exactly how to use your opponent's weaknesses while avoiding fights where they have an advantage. Sanders' test flights in September 1942. Sanders gave American pilots that understanding. They learned that the Zero's amazing low-speed maneuverability came with a cost of high-speed control stiffening. They learned that the Zero's long range came with a cost of being easy to damage. They learned that. The Zero's lightweight came with a cost to its strength and pilot protection. Every advantage has a matching disadvantage. Every design choice has trade-offs. Sanders wrote down those trade-offs in detail, and American combat pilots used that information to stay alive and shoot down the enemy. Today, small pieces of the Akutan Zero are still in museums. A fragment is in the Alaska Aviation Heritage Museum in Anchorage. A few other pieces are in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Most of the plane was destroyed when the Helldiver's propeller chopped it up in February 1945. But the impact of that plane lives on in the history of naval aviation and in the tactical lessons that are still taught to fighter pilots today. Fight smart. Know your enemy. Use their weaknesses. Avoid their strengths. Use your advantages. Sanders understood that. He flew the Zero 24 times. He wrote down everything. He made the reports that saved lives. Then he went back to work testing the next plane on the schedule. That is how real innovation happens in war. Not through big strategies or political decisions, but through test pilots who fly enemy planes, write down what they learn, and make sure that information reaches the people who need it. Sanders did not change the design of American fighters. He changed how American pilots fought, and that made all the difference.